July 18, 1944. Normandy hedgerow country, 6 kilometers south of Saint-Lô, France. 03:23 p.m. The German panzer officer stopped counting at Sherman 37, overwhelmed by the sheer number of American tanks advancing across open farmland that his Tiger I should have dominated. Oberleutnant Ernst Barkmann, commanding a single Tiger tank from Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101 and a veteran of the Eastern Front, where superior German armor had routinely destroyed Soviet tank battalions, sat in his turret watching a phenomenon that contradicted everything Wehrmacht tactical doctrine assumed about armored warfare. Across 800 meters of Norman countryside, American M4 Sherman tanks advanced in coordinated platoons, absorbing losses from his 88mm gun that would have broken any Soviet formation, yet continuing to maneuver, flank, and saturate his position with 75mm fire that couldn't penetrate his frontal armor but was forcing him to reposition constantly. What Barkmann didn't know was that he was witnessing the culmination of an American industrial and tactical philosophy that German engineers had dismissed as crude mass production, incapable of defeating superior German engineering. A philosophy that would deploy 49,234 Sherman tanks against Germany's 1,347 Tigers and prove that wars aren't won by the best tanks but by enough adequate tanks employed correctly. The M4 Sherman, a tank German technical intelligence officers had called inferior in every measurable category to German medium tanks. But between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced Shermans at rates that made individual superiority irrelevant, deployed them in numbers that overwhelmed tactical advantages, and employed them with a combined arms doctrine that German forces, designed for tank versus tank dueling, couldn't counter effectively. And across Europe, from Normandy to the Elbe, the cheap tank that wasn't supposed to defeat German armor did exactly that, not through superior performance, but through superior numbers, superior logistics, and superior understanding that armored warfare was combined arms combat, not medieval jousting with cannons. The story begins not with the Sherman, but with a fundamental disagreement about what tanks were supposed to accomplish. 1940, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The U.S. Army, observing German blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France, recognized that modern warfare required mobile, armored forces. But American tank doctrine in 1940 reflected World War I thinking. Tanks were infantry support weapons, designed to accompany foot soldiers in breakthrough operations. Speed was secondary to armor protection. Firepower was optimized for destroying fortifications, not enemy tanks. This doctrine produced the M3 Lee Grant medium tank, a 30-ton vehicle mounting a 75mm gun in a hull sponson and a 37mm gun in a rotating turret. The design was obsolete before production began, compromised by the sponson-mounted main gun that couldn't traverse independently of the hull. But the M3 was what American industry could build quickly using existing automotive manufacturing techniques, and speed of production mattered more than optimal design. The M3 entered production in August 1941. By December 1941, when America entered the war, approximately 1,000 M3s had been built. The tank was adequate for its designed role, infantry support, but tactically limited. The hull-mounted 75mm couldn't engage targets without exposing the entire vehicle. The high silhouette made concealment difficult. The riveted armor construction created spalling, metal fragments blown off the inside of armor plates when struck by enemy fire that injured crews even when the armor wasn't penetrated. But the M3 was never intended as America's primary medium tank. Even as M3 production ramped up, The U.S. Ordnance Department was designing its replacement, the M4 Sherman. The design philosophy was pragmatic rather than optimal. The Sherman would use the same basic chassis and powertrain as the M3, minimizing retooling costs and enabling rapid production transition. But the 75mm gun would be mounted in a fully rotating turret, enabling engagement without hull exposure. The armor would be welded or cast rather than riveted, eliminating spalling. And critically, the design would prioritize mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance over maximum performance. The first M4 Sherman rolled off production lines in February 1942. The design was conservative. Armor thickness ranged from 51mm on the frontal hull to 38mm on the sides, adequate against German 50mm and 75mm guns at normal combat ranges, but vulnerable to the 88mm guns mounted on German heavy tanks. The 75mm M3 gun could penetrate approximately 60mm of armor at 500 meters, sufficient to defeat German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks from frontal aspects, but inadequate against Tiger and Panther frontal armor. Maximum speed was 38 kilometers per hour on roads, 26 kilometers per hour cross-country. The Continental R975 radial aircraft engine produced 400 horsepower, giving an adequate power-to-weight ratio, but nothing exceptional. The range was approximately 190 kilometers, limited by the gasoline engine's fuel consumption. By German engineering standards, the Sherman was mediocre. German technical intelligence officers who examined captured Shermans in North Africa noted multiple deficiencies: inadequate armor protection, insufficient main gun penetration, and gasoline engines that burned when penetrated. The assessment concluded that Sherman tanks posed minimal threat to German Panzer IV medium tanks and no threat whatsoever to Tiger or Panther heavy tanks. What German analysts failed to understand was that American doctrine didn't envision Shermans fighting German tanks. American armor doctrine, refined through 1942 and 1943, assigned different roles to different vehicle types. Sherman medium tanks were exploitation vehicles, break through enemy lines, advance rapidly into rear areas, disrupt logistics and command structures. Enemy tanks would be engaged by tank destroyers, fast, heavily armed vehicles designed specifically for anti-tank combat. The M10 and later M36 tank destroyers mounted high-velocity guns capable of defeating German heavy tanks from advantageous positions. The doctrine was sound theoretically, but failed practically because battlefields don't respect doctrinal boundaries. When Shermans encountered German tanks, which happened frequently, they had to fight regardless of whether doctrine said tank destroyers should handle anti-tank missions. The Sherman's 75mm gun and thin armor made these engagements unfavorable. German Panthers could engage Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, where Sherman return fire was ineffective. Tigers could destroy Shermans frontally at any combat range, while remaining immune to 75mm fire from frontal aspects. But individual tank versus tank engagements weren't how armored warfare actually worked. The decisive factor in armored combat wasn't which tank could penetrate more armor or survive more hits. It was which side could deploy more tanks, maintain them operationally, and employ them as part of combined arms teams, integrating infantry, artillery, and air support. American industrial capacity produced Shermans at rates German industry couldn't approach. In 1943, American factories produced 21,245 Sherman tanks. Germany produced 5,966 Panzer IV medium tanks and 1,768 Panther heavy tanks, less than one-third of Sherman production despite the Panther's supposed technical superiority. In 1944, Sherman production reached 17,926 units. German production increased to 8,300 Panthers and 1,200 Tigers, but the combined total was still less than 60% of American Sherman production. More critically, American tanks reached combat units and remained operational. The Sherman was designed for reliability and ease of maintenance. Standardized parts could be manufactured by multiple suppliers and installed by minimally trained mechanics. The Continental radial engine was used in aircraft and trucks, making spare parts readily available through existing supply chains. Track links, road wheels, and transmission components could be replaced in field conditions using standard tools. German tanks were engineering marvels that required specialized tools, highly trained mechanics, and parts that were often unavailable. Panther final drive units failed catastrophically after approximately 150 kilometers, requiring complete replacement that could only be performed at depot-level facilities. Tiger transmissions were complex, maintenance-intensive, and broke frequently under combat stress. The operational readiness rate, the percentage of tanks available for combat at any given time, for American armored divisions consistently exceeded 85%. For German panzer divisions, operational readiness averaged 60 to 70% and often fell below 50% during intensive operations. The numerical advantage this created was overwhelming. At the Battle of Araucourt in September 1944, the U.S. 4th Armored Division engaged the German 5th Panzer Army. The German forces included approximately 262 Panther tanks, technically superior to Shermans in armor protection and firepower. The 4th Armored Division fielded approximately 180 Sherman tanks, numerically inferior and technically outmatched in one-on-one engagements. The battle lasted 11 days. The 4th Armored Division destroyed or disabled 281 German tanks while losing 25 Shermans. The kill ratio seemed impossible, technically inferior tanks defeating technically superior ones at ratios exceeding 11-to-1. But the battle demonstrated how American doctrine actually worked. American forces didn't engage in tank duels. They used combined arms. Sherman tanks maneuvered to positions where they could engage German armor from flanks or rear aspects, where Panther armor was thinner. Artillery suppressed German infantry, preventing them from supporting their tanks with anti-tank weapons. Air support attacked German armor in assembly areas before they could reach combat. When Shermans were destroyed, replacement tanks arrived from rear areas within hours. When Panthers were disabled, they often couldn't be recovered and had to be abandoned. The Germans fought brilliantly at the tactical level. Individual Panther crews achieved kills against multiple Shermans, but they lost operationally because they ran out of tanks, fuel, ammunition, and trained crews, while American forces maintained continuous pressure through superior logistics and numerical superiority. German tankers noticed the pattern. War diaries and after-action reports from panzer units fighting in Normandy consistently described similar experiences: destroy American tanks, then face more American tanks, destroy those tanks, face even more tanks. One panzer commander noted that the Americans use tanks like ammunition. They fire them at us until we run out of shells, then drive over us. The observation was accurate. American armored doctrine accepted higher tank loss rates because American industry could replace losses. German doctrine minimized tank losses because German industry couldn't replace them. The psychological effect on German tank crews was significant. A Panther crew engaging Shermans knew that destroying individual enemy tanks didn't change the operational situation. More Shermans would arrive. German crews fought knowing that each engagement depleted irreplaceable resources, while American crews fought knowing that losses would be replaced. The cumulative stress of fighting an enemy who could afford attrition was devastating to German morale. But the Sherman's greatest advantage wasn't its numbers, it was its evolution. American tank development between 1942 and 1945 focused on incremental improvements rather than revolutionary redesigns. When the 75mm gun proved inadequate against German heavy tanks, Ordnance developed the 76mm high-velocity gun, providing better armor penetration. Shermans mounting the 76mm began reaching combat units in July 1944. The British developed the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, even more powerful than the American 76mm, and mounted it in Sherman hulls, creating the Sherman Firefly variant, capable of defeating Panthers and Tigers frontally. When crews complained about inadequate armor protection, field modifications added thickness. Units welded spare track links to hull fronts for additional protection. Ordnance approved factory installation of applique armor, additional plates bolted to existing armor on later production models. The Sherman Jumbo Assault Tank variant featured armor thickness up to 152 millimeters, making it immune to most German anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. When gasoline engines proved vulnerable to fire, later production Shermans used diesel engines, reducing fire risk. When narrow tracks caused mobility problems in muddy terrain, wider tracks were developed and retrofitted. Every identified deficiency was addressed through modification, upgrade, or variant development. The cumulative effect was that late-war Shermans, the M4A3E8, Easy 8 with 76mm gun, improved suspension, and thicker armor were substantially more capable than early war M4A1s with 75mm guns and thin armor. But the improvements were achieved without disrupting production, without requiring entirely new manufacturing processes, and without creating logistics nightmares of supporting incompatible designs. German tank development followed the opposite pattern. Rather than improving existing designs, German engineers pursued perfect new designs. When the Panther proved effective, German industry manufactured Panthers. When the Tiger I proved inadequate, engineers designed the Tiger II, heavier, more complex, and better armed, but requiring entirely new manufacturing processes. When even the Tiger II seemed insufficient, designers proposed the Maus super heavy tank weighing 188 tons and armed with a 128mm gun. The result was that German tank forces in 1945 fielded approximately 12 different tank types, each requiring unique spare parts, specialized tools, and mechanics who could work on any specific vehicle. The operational efficiency difference was decisive. The Shermans' reputation suffered from a fundamental misunderstanding about what determined victory in armored warfare. Post-war histories, particularly those written by German officers, emphasized individual tank versus tank engagements, where technically superior German tanks destroyed multiple Shermans. These accounts were accurate but misleading. Wars aren't won by favorable kill ratios in isolated engagements. They're won by deploying enough combat power to achieve operational objectives despite tactical setbacks. American forces lost approximately 4,200 Sherman tanks destroyed in combat during the European campaign. German forces lost approximately 12,000 tanks and assault guns. The American loss rate per tank deployed was higher. Shermans were more likely to be destroyed in individual engagements than German tanks, but American industry replaced losses. German industry couldn't. By April 1945, American armored divisions in Germany fielded 90 to 100% of the authorized tank strength. German panzer divisions fielded 20 to 30% of authorized strength, often operating with fewer than 20 tanks per division. The final irony was that the Sherman became the most successful tank of World War II precisely because it wasn't the best tank. The Soviet T-34 had better armor slope and a more powerful gun. The German Panther had superior frontal protection and better anti-tank capability. The British Cromwell was faster. But none of these tanks were produced in numbers approaching Sherman production, none could be maintained as easily, and none were employed as effectively within a combined arms framework. The Sherman was good enough to accomplish its mission while being cheap enough to mass produce, simple enough to maintain, and flexible enough to evolve. In warfare, good enough in overwhelming quantity beats technically perfect in inadequate quantity every time. By war's end, Shermans equipped not just American armored divisions, but British, Canadian, French, Polish, and even Soviet tank units. The tank German engineers had mocked as crude and inferior served on every front, in every theater, under every combat condition. Post-war, Shermans remained in service with armies worldwide into the 1970s, 30 years after first production, because the design's simplicity and reliability remained valuable long after technical specifications became obsolete. Modern analysis confirms what German engineers in 1942 refused to accept. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II by any individual metric, but it was the most effective tank because effectiveness is measured by operational impact rather than technical specifications. A tank that's 80% as capable as enemy tanks, but deployed in 500% greater numbers and maintained at 90% operational readiness versus 60%, will dominate regardless of theoretical inferiority. American armor doctrine understood this. German doctrine didn't. German emphasis on technical perfection produced tanks that won tactical engagements but lost operational campaigns. American emphasis on adequate performance at sustainable cost produced tanks that lost tactical engagements but won operational campaigns. The side that understood how industrial warfare actually worked defeated the side that believed superior engineering could overcome industrial capacity. In armored vehicle museums today, Sherman tanks sit on display alongside Tigers and Panthers. Museum placards note Sherman's inferior armor and armament compared to German heavy tanks. Visitors photograph the massive Tigers and sleek Panthers while barely noticing the ordinary-looking Sherman. The visual comparison suggests German tanks were superior, and in individual specifications they were. What museum placards don't explain is that the war wasn't decided by museum piece comparisons of technical specifications. It was decided which side could deploy more tanks, keep them running, and employ them effectively. The Sherman, mocked as cheap and inferior, accomplished all three, while German tanks, celebrated as engineering masterpieces, failed at all three. Oberlieutenant Barkman, sitting in his Tiger tank watching Sherman No. 37 continue advancing despite 7 Shermans already burning from his gun, learned what German engineers refused to accept. You can't outduel an enemy who refuses to duel. American tactics didn't seek tank versus tank combat. They sought to overwhelm German positions through coordinated employment of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support until German forces collapsed. The cheap tank that German engineers laughed at didn't need to be better than German tanks, it just needed to be good enough to keep advancing while German tanks ran out of fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, and crew replacements. By that measure, the Sherman was perfect. 79 years after the Normandy invasion, the lesson remains relevant. Military procurement debates continue pitting advocates of technical perfection against advocates of adequate capability at sustainable cost. The Sherman's success validates the second approach. Wars are won by deploying adequate weapons in sufficient quantity with sustainable logistics, rather than perfect weapons in inadequate quantity with unsustainable support requirements. The tank that wasn't supposed to defeat German armor overran Europe not through superior performance, but through superior understanding of how industrial warfare works. The cheap tank proved that enough good enough beats few perfect, and the most successful tank of World War II succeeded precisely because it prioritized what mattered: reliability, maintainability, and production efficiency over what looked impressive in specification sheets. They laughed at America's cheap tank. Then it overran their country while their superior tanks sat broken beside roads, out of fuel or abandoned because spare parts didn't exist. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that keeps working when perfect weapons have stopped. Sometimes winning means building enough adequate rather than few excellent. And sometimes the cheap tank wins the war while expensive tanks fill museums. The Sherman proved all three. That's why 49,234 were built, and why the cheap tank nobody respected became the tank everyone needed.